Hi. Hello. Charles
Fergus?
Berman.
Yes.
We meet at last.
Yes, finally everything is in working order.
You sound as though you're underwater. Perhaps it's the problems at my end, very likely. I don't know. Anyway, am I coming through well enough to record?
Yes, you sound fine to me. As long as you can understand what I'm saying, we should be okay.
Yes, okay. And whatever you say at your end is recording properly then?
Yeah, whatever I say goes straight through to the recording. It doesn't go through the phone. So
okay, I'm having a bit of trouble with your volume, so I might want if I miss something, I might ask you to speak a bit louder. But so far we seem to be going okay.
How's this?
So what's up?
Does it sound better, this volume?
Yes, that sounds a bit better actually.
Okay,
well
great.
Done.
All right, so we have with us F. Gwynplaine MacIntyre. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
You are. Yes, some people get it wrong.
Well, I'm glad to be in the. I'm not sure if it's a minority or a majority that doesn't. Who's had a very accomplished and varied career in a number of fields. So maybe you could, for those of our in our audience who might not be familiar, maybe you could give them maybe a broad overview of the kind of work you're doing now.
Oh, good heavens. Well, just this moment, I'm writing a murder mystery novel that takes place in American vaudeville. And I'm using the actual details of vaudeville as clues in the mystery. For example, in the days of vaudeville, it was very typical for most performers to go to a music publisher and have a song written specifically for their act that no one else could perform. And the publisher would provide the musical arrangements. You would get the piano arrangement, you would get the drummer and sound effects arrangement, you would get the trumpet, the violin, and so forth. So I have in this novel, one of the characters is a vaudeville performer who claims to be a big star, and he says he's played in the 2-a-day and the 3-a-day houses, the prestigious vaudeville houses. And as evidence, he shows his music. He has his arrangements for all his music. And the detective notices that the sheet music for the piano part and the drums are creased and worn and torn, and they've obviously been used many times. But the arrangements for the violin and the trumpet and so forth are in pristine condition, and they're almost brand new. And so she realizes that this man is lying because he's obviously played in very awful down-market 5 and 6 show a day vaudeville houses where they only had a piano and a drummer and they had no orchestra. You see, now a modern reader mightn't realize this, where they wouldn't realize the significance of this clue, but when they read the novel, they'll say, "Oh, that's right, that makes sense." You see. So I'm trying to write this novel in a way that tells a satisfying mystery, but it conveys what it was actually like in those days to have been a performer. I was fortunate to meet a couple of old vaudevillains and British music hall performers also before they all died. Well, there's still a few alive in Britain because it lasted longer there. But I'm fascinated by that period, and I do a lot of writing about it. I am also, since your radio show, I'm fascinated by old-time radio. We had some great shows in Britain, but I love listening to the recordings of American shows. I actually began when I got back. I spent some of my early years in Australia, but when I got back to Britain, I was dealing in what we would politely call junk, and I would often buy old radios, or I would offer to clear out someone's attic or clear out someone's cellar and get hold of the radios. You know, they would have an old radio. They didn't work anymore. I recall I had one called an Eddystone Twin, and one called a Pye, P-Y-E, that had the speaker in front and the tuning scale in the back. You know, these amazing old radios. They had one called a Marconi phone that was allegedly portable, but it was immensely heavy from the 1940s. So I would get hold of these old radios and I would fix them. I'd put in new valves, whatever, and I'd sell them for profit. And I built my way up from doing things like that. And I trading on the past. What one despises, another prizes. It's really quite interesting.
And as listeners to this program will know, the American programs, because they were heavily sponsored, are often in the archives are actually in a pretty good state of preservation. There are a lot of representative
I'm very interested in the sustaining shows, and it's much harder to find recordings of the shows that were sustaining, because they often were not recorded. This would interest Americans a lot. Groucho and Chico Marx did a radio program called Flywheel Flywheel and Beagle or something, and the scripts were saved. One script was saved. No, one script was lost. All the other scripts have been preserved, but the show was done live and it was not recorded. So you cannot actually hear a recording now of Groucho and Chico Marx doing it. But about 10 years ago, the scripts were performed in Britain by new actors. Frank Lazarus is one of the actors, and they've been broadcast on radio too. So it's amazing. Of course, it's not the actual Marx Brothers, but this is material they performed.
That's fascinating.
And the actors imitate the Marx Brothers. It's really amazing. I can hear a Marx Brothers radio show in Britain that's not available in the United States. Quite odd.
Well, we'll have to try and get a hold of some of those transatlantically to give people a listen to what the Marx Brothers on the radio might have sounded like, because I think of just You Bet Your Life on the radio.
I might be able to track those down for you.
Okay.
I don't know. I sometimes track things down for people. I don't do it as much as I used to. I'm semi-retired now, but I could look into that.
Okay. Thank you, if that pans out. This this area of history, both vaudeville and old-time radio, an area of history or entertainment history that's sort of it's extremely rich, but there's been less attention on it than you might think, possibly because even at the time it wasn't seen as something worth recording.
Oh, that's it. It was, well, the reason vaudeville survived for so long was because, and this is also true of the variety halls in Britain, people did not have recordings. An act would generally play 50 weeks in the circuit, and then a year later, the same act might come back to your town again. And you haven't had the opportunity to just, hit replay. So you say, oh, here's that bicycle juggler we saw who was so horrible last year. Let's see if he's any better now. And or here was that singer we liked so much. Let's see her again. Nowadays you've got this ridiculous phenomenon where somebody sees the Rocky Horror Show 1,700 times and thinks this is something to boast about, or they see Star Wars 2,000 times. Everything is recorded now, so you can see the same show, and you can TiVo it. It's a lot of the appeal of vaudeville was that you had to see it when it was there. You didn't have another opportunity.
And I think that, one interesting thing about that philosophy was that it extended even into media we now think of as recorded. So movies were disposable, and they would play it, and then they'd think they'd have no more use for it.
Well, they had to dispose of movies because up until I think the mid-1940s, possibly a bit later, but well into the sound era, most films would put on nitrate stock, and they're dangerous to store. They're not only combustible, they can actually be considered explosive. And you really didn't want to sit on a large pile of them because they could explode. And it's very sad. Very often, when you see an old movie where there's a bonfire in the film, they're usually burning the old films. The prop man needed something flammable to create the bonfire, so they had a lot of old films.
That's just ruined a lot of scenes and
sense of reissue. Ironically, we actually have more old films from the early silent era, like, say, the teens, 1915, 1918. We have more of those than we have late silence from, say, 1925. Because, when sound came in, all silent films were suddenly a dead issue. It's oh my God, nobody will ever want to see this movie again because it doesn't talk, so there's no point in us saving it. Whereas if a movie was released in 1914, it might be re-released in 1922, or thereabouts. So they did save them often, but not always. I am very excited about this news item just this week.
Oh yes, we should definitely explain this because it's
Film Institute is reconditioning, they're restoring, they're converting to acetate film stock a lot of American and other silent films that they have located in New Zealand. When a so-called lost film turns up nowadays, it often turns up in a very remote place. They've shown up in Australia, they've shown up in New Zealand, quite a few showed up in the Yukon, Dawson City, Yukon, because basically this was the end of the exhibition circuit. And they weren't going to, it just cost too much money to ship the film back to the studio, to the original production company. So they usually just chucked it out in the woods or something, or they threw it out back. So, or literally out back in the case of some of these Australian films that have turned up. So they do turn up. Unfortunately, this can't go on much longer because the nitrate stock is unstable, and very often a film was put away quite neatly in a sealed canister, and everyone knew exactly where it was. And then 50 years on, someone opened up the tin, and it was full of vinegar soup. So it's not necessarily a matter of a film being physically lost. It just very often they did put the film away and it just self-combusted. Yeah,
and I think people often don't realize when they see one of their favorite silent films or one of the they see Nosferatu or something like that, they don't realize how lucky it is that particular film survives and how many might not.
Nosferatu, there was an active attempt to suppress the film because it was an unauthorized film version of Dracula. Bram Stoker died in 1912. In fact, he died the same week the Titanic sank. And he wasn't aborted, though. Although two science fiction writers were aborted, actually. But when Murnau made Nosferatu, Bram Stoker's widow conducted a legal action to suppress the film, and fortunately a couple of prints survived and they were duplicated. A film I should very much like to find, and I suspect that it no longer exists, is a film called Die Januskopf, which was an unauthorized film version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Really?
Starring Conrad Veidt. Bela Lugosi was in it, although he wasn't famous yet. He had a small role in it, apparently, and I have not seen that film. I have no evidence that it actually does exist. I've made a slight attempt to look for it, but the evidence is that it was suppressed and destroyed.
Well, that's it's kind of typical of a problem people have once they start watching some of these older films from the 20s or 30s to say, well, I'd like to see more of this person's work, this director or this actor, and then suddenly finding a good portion of their work isn't there or can't be found.
Well, of course, I'm sure most people listening to you are vaguely aware, at least, or perhaps they even know the details. There was a scandal affecting Roscoe Arbuckle, the silent film comedian. He was accused of raping and murdering a woman, and he was actually put on trial 3 times for this. There were 2 hung juries, and then he was acquitted. But even though he was acquitted, the scandal ruined his career. His film studio was Paramount, and his movies, just nobody in the United States wanted them anymore. There was this impression that, clean living people don't go to see a Roscoe Arbuckle movie. But Paramount were able to release his films in Europe. And for example, I've seen he made a film called The Life of the Party, which I've seen with Polish. Yes, Polish. I've seen it with Polish titles because a Polish film archive saved it. Whereas, in the United States, people just didn't want to save his films anymore. There was this very unfair perception about him that he was not fit for viewing, which of course was very unfair. A lot of his films were banned in Britain for decades. I saw his film, the British Film Institute showed his film Leap Year back in the 1970s, and it was quite an event because this was the very first time it had ever been shown in Britain. When it was originally released just after the scandal, the British Board of Film Censors refused an exhibition certificate simply because of that ridiculous, unfair scandal. There was this perception that so it's quite unfair, but consequently, a lot of his material has been lost.
Well,
very sad. Yeah. Paramount and MGM were usually quite good about retrieving the prints of their old films. When an old film shows up somewhere, it's usually because a projectionist, quote unquote, forgot to return the film, but those are generally not Paramount or MGM films because they were pretty good at retrieving them. And Fox, this was before 20th Century Fox, there was the silent film studio founded by William Fox that merged with 20th Century. They had a warehouse fire in the 1930s, so they had almost all the studio's films were in one convenient place, and then that place burnt down. So it's difficult to find a Fox. For instance, Sita Bara, most of her films are believed lost. A few do survive. It's quite sad that so much of this is gone. But it is encouraging that they do turn up, and they tend to turn up in unexpected places.
And it seems almost the most unlikely places one could even think of.
Generally, the most unlikely places. Someone found a Lon Chaney film in a porch. Someone had they didn't like the porch steps on their house, and they jackhammered them to build a new porch, and there was a can of film with the Oubliette in it, with Lon Chaney in it. I had a fascinating experience. I can't take credit for this. I was just a member of the audience, but there's a wonderful film festival I try to attend every October in Pordenone, Italy, northern Italy, called Giornate del Cinema Muto, Festival of Silent Films. And they show silent films. And 4 years ago, 2006, they showed a film I never expected to see anywhere. They showed the earliest known Lon Chaney film, which is a slapstick comedy called Poor Jake's Demise. And I never expected this film to exist, much less that I would ever see it. And the curator told me, I was amazed how they found this. It showed up in May 2006. Someone had a can of film with the name Charlie Bowers written on the tin. And Charlie Bowers was an American film comedian of the 1920s, and he wasn't especially popular. And so there was no real hurry to open up this tin of film, except to convert it to acetate. And when they opened it up, they discovered it wasn't really a Charlie Bowers film. It was a film starring a man named Max Asher, who looked a bit like Charlie Bowers. And in a supporting role in the same film was Lon Chaney. So because of that, and Louise Fazenda is in it also. She married Hal Wallace, the Paramount film producer. So she retired, but she was a pretty funny actress. She was in the Alice in Wonderland film with W.C. Fields and Cary Grant and Gary Cooper. She was a popular actress for a while. So they were able to show this film in October 2006 in Pordenone, Italy, where I saw it with my chin on the floor in astonishment, because I never thought I would actually see this movie. And they do turn up, but so much is lost. And people have got to act quickly because I know exactly where this film is. It's on the shelf. It's safe, and they leave it there for a bit, and then they open it up, and it's vinegar soup. So the nitrate can't wait. It really is a very sad story.
So it's possible to have seen a film 3 years ago, and then now it may not even exist in any known copies.
That does happen, and I know private collectors who have nitrate films or who have had them, and they generally do try to convert them as quickly as possible either to acetate stock or now to a digitized image, to DVD or something. Unfortunately, I think people are rather jaded now that they... because they can get a film on DVD, they think that everything's on DVD, and they've got all the extras. They see a 1940s movie on DVD, and there are no extras. They expect these things. It's actually happened to me when I see an actual old film. I have a gizmo called a Steenbeck, which is, the Steenbeck company. They're famous for making flatbed editing machines, which are very large and heavy and unwieldy, but I have a handheld Steenbeck device. I actually bring it with me on flights. I check it in with my baggage, and they all think it's a weapon or something because it looks so odd. But it's about the size of a hockey stick, and it's basically something that one can run a film through this fairly easily. But when I look at an old film that's literally an old film, I'm accustomed to deterioration. Meaning when I'm watching a physical reel of film, I'm accustomed to deterioration, and it gets wobbly and so on. But when I see something on video or DVD, I'm accustomed to it, being a nice, clear, sharp image. And recently I viewed a 1920s film on DVD, and it was made from a very bad print. So I'm seeing all the spots and the streaks and the damage. I'm saying, what's wrong with this DVD? And of course it was made from bad source material. But now they can digitize this. And I'll tell you one of my personal projects. Most of your fans have probably seen the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers, which was actually in legal limbo for a long time because George S. Kaufman and his estate owned the soundtrack, and Paramount owned the physical images on the film, and they couldn't come to a deal. But anyway, this is the movie with the song "Hooray for Captain Spaulding." And there's a line in the film where Groucho is at the reception as Captain Spaulding, and Margaret Dumont is singing "He was the only white man who covered every acre." You could actually lose your radio license if I sing on your station. You know.
Well, we can bleep it if it gets too bad.
But anyway, she's thinking, well, the only one, no, covered every acre. And Groucho leers at the camera and he sings, I think I'll try to make her, hooray, hooray, hooray. And this line got a whacking huge laugh in 1930 when the film was released. It was re-released in the late 30s, about 35 or 37, and by then the Hayes office were in business, and that line was cut out. So if you see the movie now on DVD, there's a very, very obvious cut in the film. There's several seconds missing, and the actors just sort of jump, you know, as the film jumps, because that dirty, dirty, dirty line was cut out of the film. So I'm thinking of hiring a couple of CGI wonks to, digital people to get hold of that film and recreate the missing bit. You know, using the existing image of the room and Groucho and Margaret Dumont and the actors in the background, one of whom is Dennis O'Keefe before he became famous, and so on. I would like to try to recreate those missing few seconds.
You could probably get very close now.
I should think so. Yeah. Of course, nobody knows exactly what's in there unless it does turn up. But I was very intrigued to see one of my favorite musicals was made in the 70s. It was 1776.
Oh, yes.
The musical about the signing of the Declaration of Independence. It was the only film ever personally produced by Jack L. Warner, the head of Warner Brothers. It was the only film he personally produced. And there's a song in that film that was done originally in the stage musical called Cool, Cool Conservative Men. And Jack L. Warner screened a preview print for his personal friend Richard Nixon, who was president at the time. And Nixon didn't like that number. He said, I think it makes fun of conservatives. So Warner cut it out of the film. And I saw the film in Britain. I had been very, very peripherally involved with the British stage production, which starred Ronald Rad and David Kernan. And I saw the film, and I was disappointed that number was cut out. And I thought, I'll never, never, never see it. And I've seen the film on television, and that number was missing. And then the last time I saw the film on television, I was pleasantly astounded that number has been put back in. They actually found the old footage and the old soundtrack, and they retroactively edited the film so that a song that was cut out, if you saw the movie in its original release back in, I think, 1972 or thereabouts, a song that has been missing all these years is now back in the film. And this should interest your nostalgia viewers. There was a film made by 20th Century Fox around 1940 called Tales of Manhattan. And it was a sort of an anthology film. It was about a tailcoat. The title is a pun. Tales of Manhattan. It was about a man's formal coat with tails. And it's originally made for the character played by Charles Boyer. And then he sells it, and then someone else ends up wearing it. Charles Lawton wears it. Paul Robeson gets hold of it. It was Paul Robeson's last film, I think. It's a multi-story film about all the various people who have this tailcoat. And they filmed a sequence where W.C. Fields wears this coat, and Margaret Dumont is in that sequence with him. And when they previewed the film in the 1940s, they decided the movie was too long, and they cut out the whole W.C. Fields sequence. And all these years, I've been aware that W.C. Fields was in this movie, and yet he's not there. If you see the movie, he's completely missing. A few years back, someone actually found the W.C. Fields footage and put it in, and if you see this movie on DVD, he's in there.
It's a little
So,
shocking that...
all you W.C. Fields fans who are saying, gee, I sure wish there'd be a new W.C. Fields film, in a sense there actually is.
I was going to say, it's a little shocking that they would say, well, the film's too long, let's cut out W.C. Fields, of all things.
Well, because he was making movies. Well, actually, bear in mind, he was not a 20th Century Fox actor. He happened to make that one film for them. So they had no real stake in him. They didn't want to build him up as a box office name. He was mostly Paramount, and then he ended up at Universal. It very often happens back in the studio era. Actors often did their most interesting work on loan out to some other studio because their home studio wanted to protect their image. And they said, we don't want him doing kicking babies out windows, But then they'd loan someone out to another studio, and they would get a chance to do some really interesting work. For instance, Clark Gable won his Oscar for It Happened One Night, which was a Columbia film. He was an MGM actor, so they loaned him out to Columbia. He did things in that Columbia movie that MGM would not have let him do. So consequently, he gave one of his best performances.
One of the places people can see some of your work and read some of it about film is your reviews you have on the internet, the Internet Movie Database. Oh yes,
imdb.com. I should say one thing here. Anyone can post a review to imdb.com, and they don't pay for anything. Anything I give them is just for sheer love of film. They don't give me any money for that. And they hold the copyright on anything that anyone posts to them. I've actually got emails from people who tell me, oh, I love your reviews. I wish you would collect them in a book. I don't own them, so I can't, legally I cannot collect them. I also, frankly, get emails from people who hate my reviews, or individual reviews. I got a death threat from someone because I said something unpleasant about Buddy Hackett. So there's somewhere out there is a crazed Buddy Hackett fan who is determined to kill me. Someone threatened to beat me up because I reviewed Don Knotts, and I said something mildly favorable about him, and it should have been an unqualified rave, according to this other person. So because I kind of sort of like Don Knotts, I'm now marked for a beatdown, whereas I'm supposed to just have, give him unqualified raves. So some people like my work, some people hate my work, but of course I don't actually do that for a living since I don't get paid for it. It's just, a side interest.
Well, I guess that's one thing people should know about doing it, is that you don't retain the copyright, and it can be physically dangerous.
It can actually be hazardous to one's health, yes, to write for IMDb, yes. And they also reject some of my reviews because I say something, like I reviewed a Bollywood movie and I made a bad pun. There were people, there were Hindu dancers in the movie, and I called them Gandhi dancers. And I posted that review, and then they took it down because someone considered it offensive to Hinduism or something. I don't know. So it's impossible to please everyone.
Yeah.
I think maybe Roger Ebert is. Well, no, some people don't like him either. But I think he got a death threat at least once. But no matter what one writes, there's always going to be someone who doesn't like it or disagrees with it or whatever.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. But I find just there's a volume of knowledge there and films that information about films that I made.
Are you talking about IMDb, or are you talking about me personally?
But, well, you and what I've seen you write there.
Thank you. Yeah. I feel that a film review, anyone writing a review of any film, should not be just one's personal opinion. I mean, anyone can say, "Oh, this movie stinks," or "Oh, I love this movie." I should convey why I liked this film, or why I didn't like this film, or why I like this film but I dislike the particular actress's performance, and so on. So, I try to put something in the context of its time. For example, a movie might have a prohibition joke in it.
Mm-hmm.
Or that modern audiences wouldn't get. I recently
which was a huge
saw
theme in
a
comedy.
lot of the old Vitaphone shorts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, American pronunciation, Vitaphone. I have to remember to say Vitaphone, not Vitaphone. Warner Brothers in the early 20s set up a studio in Brooklyn, where Roscoe Arbuckle also made his only 6 sound films, by the way, but they recorded a lot of vaudeville acts that were performing in New York at the time. And I've been watching these. There's a wonderful fellow, Ron Hutchinson, who runs something called the Vitaphone Project. And he let me see some of these films. And I'm watching a comedian doing his act, and he tells a joke about a man wearing a red necktie.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm 5 minutes later, I'm watching another Vitaphone short in the same batch that was actually made 3 years later in the same studio. And here's a totally different comedian, and he tells a joke about a man wearing a red necktie. And I thought, hello, that's very odd. Why would that be funny? For 3 or 4 years, And I did some research, and it turned out that in America, in the late 20s and the early 30s, red necktie was a code phrase that there were jokes that you could spot a gay man because he wore a red necktie, supposedly. Now, I have absolutely no idea if this is actually true, but I have discovered in old joke books and so on that there were a body of jokes based on that premise. Whereas, for example, in Britain, if you say a man is a window dresser, he does the displays in shop windows. That's the joke is that, well, he must be gay. So they were doing jokes like that. So if I see something in a film, in an old film, that I recognize as an historic reference, that the people of that time would get that we don't, not necessarily a joke, just any sort of a reference, I try to put this in the review. I will explain the film as best I can, or I will praise a particular montage or a dance sequence or something. If there's something of note in there, or if I happen to know something about one of the actors in the film, that might be relevant to the film but isn't visible in the film, something like that, I'll put that in. I like, for example, in the Monkey Business, Groucho is with Thelma Todd, and he has a line, he says, "You be a good girl, I'll lock you in the garage." And it just got a straight laugh in 1933. 2 years later, Thelma Todd was murdered in her garage in real life. So when a line in a movie, when something in a movie, a line, a piece of business, whatever, when in hindsight, in retrospect, if it's ironic or if it has some added significance later on, then I like to comment on that. If it refracts the film in some way, if it changes one's perception of the film, I like to put those things in.
You talk about branching off a little bit. You talk about seeing these films with the curator, I suppose, of the Vitaphone Project, which is a website also people can visit.
As long as I'm giving shout-outs to people, I'd like to say hello to my big fans, Curtis and Barbara Parrish in Minnesota. I actually do have a few fans. There are a few people who actually do like me, and they email me and say, "Oh, I read your stories in the magazines. I read your articles." And So I told them I might be on this radio show, and they said, "Oh, they wish they could hear it out in Minnesota."
Well, we'll put it.
Anyway, I'm sorry, you were saying.
We'll put it on the internet so they can, you can send them the link to that. Well, I was saying that you saw those films there. If people out there are interested in getting a chance to see some of these unusual or rarely seen films, how would you say they could get into doing that themselves?
That's a very sore point for me, because I review a film and then I get an email from a total stranger and they just automatically assume that I have it on DVD. And all I need to do is just run off a copy and email it to them, or do it as an MP3 and upload it, or they don't accept that a lot of things are only barely accessible.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see more work converted to video, and you can order it on eBay or Amazon. Some rare old film, no longer so rare. I am fortunate that I have the resources that I'm able to travel, although I don't travel as much as I used to, because it's just not fun anymore to travel now. But I go every year, if I can, to the Pordenone Film Festival in Italy. And one reason I go to it is because there are actually several other film festivals in Italy that same month. And then when I get back to London, there's the annual festival at the National Film Theatre, which is now called BFI South Bank, British Film Institute South Bank, in London. So there's a big festival there. I am fortunate that I have the time and the resources, after working so hard for so long, that I'm able to go see a film. And when I speak with a private collector or an archive, very often they say, "Oh yes, we have that film. If you come here at our convenience, we'll schedule a screening for you, but we are not going to lend this film out." So basically, I'm able to see a film because I'm able to go to the film. And sadly, I recognize most people can't drop everything and go off to see a movie. But what saddens me is that most people won't. They honestly think, "Oh, I just press a button and this movie I reviewed will upload, and there it is in their inbox with extras, with DVD extras." And sadly, the world just isn't configured that way. So it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, well, I envy you the chances you've had to go all over and see it.
It all balances out. I've had a few enviable opportunities, but I've had some extremely unenviable experiences. So I envy Oliver Twist's childhood. He had an easy childhood compared to me.
I'm sorry to hear that.
It all evens out. I've had some very pleasant evenings in darkened cinemas, and I've also had a few bad patches. So I'm not someone who should be envied, frankly.
I'm sorry to hear.
Well, I'm sorry to say it.
But going back, maybe we can talk about, since we're on film, the Trove in New Zealand. Maybe you can explain why this particular find is so important.
Any lost film is worthy of at least one look to see if it, what's in there. But I am in contact with several of the archivists and curators at that film archive, and they've released a mouth-watering list of what's on there. They've got about 75 films, and there are a couple of real gems in there. One of them is a film called Upstream that was directed by John Ford. And of course, he's considered one of the all-time great directors. someone asked Orson Welles to name the three greatest film directors, and he said John Ford, John Ford, and John Ford. But Upstream is very intriguing because I have not seen it yet, but I have had a report from someone who has seen it in New Zealand and who told me what's going on. It was a backstage film, and of course John Ford is mostly associated with action films, so it's atypical. And Ford made this film at Fox, and again, any film that shows up from Fox is probably rare because of their fire in the 30s. But while John Ford was at Fox, F.W. Murnau, the same man who made Nosferatu in Germany, was under contract at Fox, and apparently Murnau taught John Ford various directorial techniques involving backlighting and so forth. And I've been told from my source in New Zealand that this John Ford film shows a strong Murnau influence, and I very much want to see that. Also, the subject matter, a backstage film, is really much more a Murnau subject than a John Ford subject. So I want to see that. Another film they've got from that's 1927, I think. Another one they've just found from 1923 is called Maytime. Now, you may have seen Nelson Eddy, Jeanette MacDonald made a film in the 30s called Maytime, and ostensibly that is a remake of the silent film. But in fact, MGM didn't like the script that they had, and they chucked out the whole script for Maytime and wrote a whole new script. Maytime was originally a stage musical, and they filmed it in 23 at Paramount as a silent, and they kept the original script. Apparently, this is again, I'm reporting based on what my sources in New Zealand have told me. They've kept the original stage script that Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald did not use, that they chucked out. So here is a chance to see this film and get some sense of what the original stage musical was like. Also, a supporting role in Maytime, the 23 version, was played by Clara Bow, who was not quite yet a star as of 23. I'm astounded at how popular her films remain. I think Madonna wanted to star in a film bio of Clara Bow at one point. You schedule a Clara Bow festival someplace, and people will knock the door down to see her. For some reason, she's incredibly popular. I like her films myself, but I don't go too far out of my way to see them. But she had only a supporting role in this film, but because she's in it, it's now being treated as a Clara Bow film, a lost Clara Bow film refound. Just as Poor Jake's Demise, I mentioned, which I saw in 2006, is being treated as a Lon Chaney film, even though he actually has only a supporting role in it. Very often a film shows up or revives interest, rather, because of a peripheral actor or peripheral person who is now of interest, rather than the star. A lot of the stars of the films, a lot of them are now totally forgotten. I find it quite sad that people who were huge movie stars in the 1920s are now totally forgotten. Or they're remembered only for some ridiculous reason, like I continue to hear the urban myth that John Gilbert had a high-pitched voice. Greta Garbo's leading man, John Gilbert. Allegedly, he was a big star. Well, he was a big star in silence, but allegedly he had a very high-pitched, effeminate voice, and so his career was wrecked. No, he just was a very self-destructive man, and the studio didn't want to keep him on, so MGM. So he had a perfectly decent speaking voice, but he just his day had passed. But one still encounters these false characters. It's quite sad.
Absolutely. Well, little bits of information get repeated, it seems like, and it leads to it's an interesting story.
This
but
happens in radio also. I get infuriated when I hear that story. There was a children's radio host, Uncle Don, and there's that notorious story. I'm sure all your listeners have heard it. Allegedly, Uncle Don finished his broadcast, and then he said, "Are we off the air? Good. That ought to hold those little bastards." Someone actually faked that in the 60s or the 70s and included it in a record of radio bloopers. So there are, I've heard it. It's just fake. People say, "Oh, I know that story's true because I heard it. I have the old record." No, there was a showbiz columnist who had he had a couple of lines left in his column one day. He was on deadline and he had to fill the column. So he said, "Oh, a funny thing happened the other day. Uncle Don thought he was off the air, and he wasn't. And he just stuck this in his newspaper column. And to this day, people think it's true, and it's just not true. And there's a lot of these weird old stories. Somebody told me, as a fact, Clint Eastwood is the son of Stan Laurel. I mean, where do these stories come from? It's not true." So one reason I write these reviews is I try to put paid to these old rumors. I try to if something is widely perceived to be true but it's not true, I will mention it in the review, and I'll say, "But no, it didn't really happen," or "That's not how it happened." So I try to, since I don't get paid to write them, I do them largely to entertain and to inform, and hopefully to elevate the level of discussion a bit.
Now, the writing you do get paid to do, I know I've seen you have short stories in magazines, and you have.
Oh yes, I have a short. I have two stories that just came out this month. I'm in a science fiction magazine. I wrote a time travel story called "Another Fine Messiah," which sounds like a Laurel and Hardy reference. It actually isn't. It's a magazine called Space and Time, the spring issue, and I have a story in an anthology that's coming out just this month in Britain called the Mammoth Book of Apocalyptic Science Fiction. I wrote a story in there called World Without End, in which I actually destroy the entire universe. It can't be bad. And that book will be coming out in the States. It's called The Mammoth Book of the End of the World. For some reason, the American publisher thinks Americans won't understand the word apocalyptic. So it has a different title here for some reason in the stateside for where your listeners are. I write novels, I write short stories. I do a lot of corporate writing. I do writing for clients that doesn't have my name on it. I used to write for the New York Daily News. I live part-time in New York City, and I've written some articles for them about New York's cultural life. I wrote, for example, Harold Lloyd, his last silent film, Speedy. He filmed it in New York City. He played a New York City cab driver, and he picks up Babe Ruth as a fare, and Babe Ruth wants to get to Yankee Stadium in heavy traffic. So I wrote an article for the Daily News about how Lloyd actually filmed that movie in New York City, and I've written some theater articles. I love the theater. The theater is even more ephemeral than film, and every performance is unique. In fact, I'll show just to show your listeners rather. You go see a movie, and a man walks in and he chucks his hat at the hat rack in the movie. If it lands on the hat rack, you know that that's in the script. And maybe they had to do 800 takes until it landed there, but at least it happened. If he chucks the hat at the hat rack and he misses, then you know that was in the script also. You go see a play. There's a hat rack on stage. A man enters, he takes off his hat, he throws it at the hat rack. Whatever happens is real, and it's for this performance. You know, maybe I'll sit there and I'll see the performance where the hat misses the hat rack. And then a friend of mine sees the same play the following night, and the hat hits the hat rack. You know, the theater is magical.